Good evening, everyone. So I think we're going to get started here tonight. Just want to say a big warm welcome here. I want to thank everybody for coming out on this gorgeous evening. So tonight we're really excited here. This is actually the first time since 2019 we've had an in-person fall lecture. So very excited. As you know, the past 3 years have certainly underscored the importance of human connection. And as I look around the room tonight, I am full of gratitude for the people who are here, for our colleagues, for our Windward community, for some alumni here tonight, and certainly our special guests. I want to thank you all for being here, and as well as those who are at home. I think we have around 700 plus folks joining us, both at home here. So very excited to see everyone at home and here. So give them a big round of applause for coming out tonight. Thank you so much. As you may know, Windward is deeply committed to advancing the understanding and advocacy around language-based learning disabilities. And our free community lectures, which we offer twice a year, play a central role in sharing our expertise out in the community. Each fall and spring, we actually invite an esteemed practitioner researcher in the field of literacy to present a lecture on a topic relevant to our school's mission in the interest of informing, inspiring, and engaging our community in this important work. At Windward, we believe clarity of diagnosis is the foundation upon which remediation rests. This is the reason we prefer the term language-based learning disability as opposed to the term learning difference. In order to serve the students in this population the way they deserve, a critical first step in that work is defining the inherent challenges they face. In tonight's lecture, we'll explore the developmental language disorder, a learning disability that is as prevalent as dyslexia, but often remains hidden and unaddressed. Developmental language disorder can impact how a child communicates, how they listen, how they learn to read, and how they execute academic tasks. It can also coexist with dyslexia. But these are distinct disorders that do not always overlap. In tonight's lecture, Dr. Hogan will explain the characteristics of developmental language disorder, or DLD, and ways to identify it. She'll also compare and contrast dyslexia and DLD and discuss the impacts of DLD on academic outcomes. And finally, she's going to offer some ways to support kids with DLD at both school and at home. But before I introduce Dr. Hogan tonight, I'd like to present this year's John J. Russell Award for Advocacy in Education. Established in 2019, the Windward School Board of Trustees, to honor our former head of school, Dr. J. Russell, who's here with us tonight, this award is given out annually to an individual or individuals who have made an impact in helping children with language-based learning disabilities achieve their full potential. Award recipients' efforts may be in the fields of research, in pedagogy, in legislation, education, or business. And I am deeply, deeply honored tonight to present this year's award to Emerson and Georgette Dickman. Emerson and Georgette have been leaders for more than 4 decades in dyslexia education, research, and advocacy. Emerson has devoted his entire career in law and special education and child advocacy, specializing in representing children and adults with disabilities. He often states that his own experiences as an individual with dyslexia has deepened his understanding of and sensitivity to the special needs of this population and the concerns of their families. He is the past president of the International Dyslexia Association and was a founding member, and this is a really important point, was a founding member of the Consensus Committee gathered in 1992 to create the legal definition of dyslexia. He regularly speaks about dyslexia on the national and international stage and promoting awareness and advocacy. In 2012, Emerson, along with his wife Georgette, won the Margaret Bird Rawson Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Dyslexia Association. Georgette has dedicated her career in education as a teacher, Orton Gillingham therapist trainer, and director of the Children's Dyslexia Center and professor at the Center of Dyslexia Studies at the Fairleigh and Dixon University. She has served on the International Dyslexia Association's branch council and nominating committee and is the past president of the New Jersey branch of the IDA. Georgette is also a trustee on the board of the Kildonan Services, whose mission is to reveal and illuminate the strengths of individuals with dyslexia and or language-based learning disabilities. In 2005, along with Emerson, she was named Outstanding Multisensory Structured Literacy Language Education Therapist by the International Multisensory Structured Language Education Council, also known as IMSLEC, who's one of our accrediting body. So jointly with Emerson, she received a Lifetime Achievement Award in 2012 by the International Dyslexia Association. Individually and together, Emerson and Georgette have had such an impact on education, supporting the livelihood of countless individuals with the dyslexia, and their work is prolific and unmatched. We are deeply thrilled to honor Emerson and Georgette Dickman this year with the John J. Russell Advocacy Award in Education. Unfortunately, they are living their best lives in France right now on retirement. So I'm sorry that you're here and not in France with them. But they did do a video. We would love to show that video accepting the award here. So we'll tee that up. Thank you.
Hello to everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. I must tell you, I'm completely shocked that I would be honored with the John J. Russell Award, and I'm really still searching for the right words to express my appreciation. It's made even more astonishing because I'm receiving it with my good friend and husband, Emerson, who has ever been a steadfast education advocate for individuals of all ages from the first day that I met him. First and foremost, as many of you in this audience know, I'm a teacher of literacy. I teach little people, medium-sized people, grown-up people. From the Lord of the Rings, Gandalf, the White Wizard, said to Frodo, all you have to do is decide what to do with the time that's given to you. Well, for me, that was an easy decision. As early as I can remember, I wanted to become a teacher. Growing up in a large family in a large house, I made the cellar my school and my little brothers my students. I even persuaded my friends in the neighborhood to teach along with me, of course, installing myself as principal, naturally. During my elementary school days, I was a volunteer homework helper for the struggling students in first, second, and third grade. My mother used to say, oh, you have so much patience. Patience? No, patience had nothing to do with it. It was the thrill of the moment when my student got it, when the concept was understood and mastered. So, as I focused on the time given to me to receive the education I needed to become a certified teacher, along the way, I met the most incredible group of mentors and colleagues and master teachers from this Windward school, who generously shared their knowledge and skills. Judy Hockman, Phyllis Burton, Eileen Perlman. They generally shared their knowledge with FDU graduate teachers, and Susan Seidel, Sandra Schwartz, Lydia Seufer. To each of you, I am grateful beyond thanks. And I'm also so fortunate that my work for the ARC of Bergen and Passaic Counties, Fairleigh Dickinson, and the Children's Dyslexia Centers has allowed me to divide my time with a good mix of administration, curriculum development, and teaching experiences. Today, as I receive this award named for a truly great administrator who had the gifts of leadership, vision, and ability to inspire, J. Russell, I invite the teachers here to join with me in accepting this honor because it really belongs to all of us. Teachers who worried about our student whose home life was a little less than ideal. Teachers who labored over lesson plans late into the evening. So for all of us who have decided that the time given to us is best used to teach, I humbly accept this award with the utmost gratitude. Thank you.
It's hard to add anything to what George is saying, but being given this award in the name of John J. Russell, a man whom I greatly admire and respect, for what I love to do is like putting icing on the cake. Georgette and I are a team, but we play different positions. My head is in the clouds and she is in the trenches. My job is easy. I have an interest in destinations. Georgette's job is hard. She figures how to get there. It is those in the trenches, like the teachers and staff at Windward School, that make dreams a reality. It is in the trenches where the real magic happens. It is at the Windward School where the difference is made. It is there that the gift of reading is bestowed. This gift offers the light of knowledge and opens minds to possibilities that would otherwise remain hidden in the shadows. Every time a child learns how to respect and enjoy the written word, A life with new possibilities is created. Windward and other like islands of excellence are a force for good that has the potential of making a difference in the lives of children that is exponentially beyond that which they could hope to accomplish on their own. Everyone in this audience is here on their own time to learn something new to help a child. There's not a person in this audience, by their presence here today, that does not display the mission and selfless dedication that would justify an award. I am a fan, a groupie. That is why I'm here. The fact that someone called me on stage is simply because I was always in the audience. Be very careful. You may be next. And thank you very much, Windward School, for the award, and John J. Russell for being a wonderful mentor for everybody. Thank you.
My hope is that they're watching it at home somewhere cozy in France right now, so just say thank you so much for your lovely video. We wish you could be here with us, so thank you. Now, I get the pleasure of introducing our featured speaker tonight. Dr. Hogan is a professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders at MGH Institute of Health Professions in Boston. She is also the director of Speech and Language Literacy Lab, as well as a research associate at Harvard University. Having published more than 100 papers on genetic, neurologic, and behavioral links between oral and written language development, Dr. Hogan's focus is on improving assessment and intervention for children with developmental language disorders, dyslexia, speech and sound disorders. She is a staunch advocate for children with reading difficulties. Dr. Hogan co-founded the Developmental Language Disorder information website, DLD and Me. She also founded and hosts the See, Hear, Speak podcast, which I think we're going to have a little crossover here on maybe with Reed here soon. She's a true expert in her field. Dr. Hogan's history of service to regional and national and international educational organizations is extensive. She currently serves as the treasurer for the New England Research on Dyslexia and on the awards committee chair for the Society of Scientific Study of Reading, and as a member of the Research and Scientific Affairs Committee for the American Speech and Language Hearing Association, just to name a few. Additionally, she regularly presents at conferences and was a keynote speaker at the first International Developmental Language Disorder Research Conference in 2021. Dr. Hogan was also featured on our own podcast here, the Windward Institute's Read podcast, where she taught listeners about the fundamental aspects of language and discussed specific language difficulties presented in children with developmental language disorders. And for those who may have missed it, you can certainly, it's not too late, you can go to our website, Windward Institute website, and you can find that. This coming January, we're actually excited to have Dr. Hogan lead a Windward Institute workshop titled Language-Based Learning Disabilities from DLD to Dyslexia, where she'll review research and talk about the language basis of reading through a developmental lens. Dr. Hogan is deeply committed to the implementation science and translating research to practice. And we are so grateful that she's here tonight. She spent the day actually touring our classrooms, getting to see our 4th grade, our 2nd grade kids in action, and talking to many of our staff. So please join me in giving a warm welcome for Dr. Hogan for tonight's presentation, Developmental Language Disorder, the highly prevalent language disability hidden in plain sight. Thank you so much, Tiffany. Come on up.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for joining me, those in person and online this evening. I want to start by thanking Windward for an amazing day where I was able to see how they impact children on a daily basis. So thank you so much for inviting me and for welcoming me into your home. I'm going to start out by acknowledging the funding sources in which I'll pull from for the presentation. So I've had the opportunity to be funded by the National Institutes of Health to follow children longitudinally, which is something you do as educators as well. So we measure children early on before they enter school, and when we measure them multiple times through the years to look at the trajectory of development of speech, language, and literacy skills over time. I've also been funded by the Institute of Education Science to do assessment and intervention work, which I will share as well. These are my disclosures. The podcast was mentioned. That is just a hobby. I'm unpaid for that. And I have the opportunity to do some consulting with several state departments of education, which is a big honor as well. So I'm going to start out the presentation. You probably didn't realize you're going to have The Simpsons tonight, but I'm going to start out with a story. This is to get us on the same page. When we're talking about reading, I want to give you an example, and I want you to think in your mind, who is really reading in this example? So in this story, Bart's in trouble, per usual. So part of his punishment is to go after school every day to visit his grandfather. His grandfather has cataracts, so he's receiving letters from family members in Germany, but he can't read those letters because he has these cataracts. So as part of Bart's punishment, he goes and he reads German letters to his grandfather. He's learning how to decode German, but he doesn't have a really good understanding of what he's reading. So he reads these letters to grandfather, and grandfather often will laugh because he really is understanding the language that's created by the text. So who's really reading in this example? Is it Bart, who's transferring the written language into something spoken? Or is it grandfather, who's actually understanding the spoken language created by the written print? So think for a moment who you might expect is reading. When I used to give this talk to different groups of people in the past, I would have you raise your hand to say who you think is reading. I won't do that tonight, especially for our online participants, but I will say that when I have presented in the past, who's reading really varies by the audience. So when I'm presenting to teachers, I will hear them say that reading is really Bart. That's a common response I receive. When I present to special educators, when I present to speech-language pathologists, they'll often raise their hand that it's grandfather who's really reading. But it's a trick question because we know that it really involves both of those processes. So I would argue that neither is reading because you have to have both of those skills to have good reading comprehension. So when I say reading, I'm talking about reading comprehension. And this is a story also that describes the simple view of reading. So the simple view of reading is the foremost representation of reading comprehension and the skills that are involved. So simple view of reading states that reading comprehension is the product of word recognition or word reading and listening comprehension. We've done several studies over time looking at children's individual differences in word reading versus listening comprehension. And what you'll see is that over time, there's a slight change in what contributes to reading comprehension. So this is the same group of children who were tested in 2nd grade, 4th grade, and 8th grade. And you can see in 2nd grade, the bottom one here, that's the amount of variation that was predicted by word reading. And you can see it goes down over time. At the top, you'll see the amount of variation that was predicted by listening comprehension. And what you'll note is that it increases dramatically across time. And then you have the shared variation between word reading and listening comprehension, which is very similar. So what does this tell us? This tells us that even though we represent the simple view of reading by saying there's equal components to word reading and listening comprehension, those components shift. So what you see is that in grade 1, this is another longitudinal data set where we follow children grade 1, 2, and 3. And you see that in the beginning, you see 0.8, and this is out of 1, versus like 0.2 for listening comprehension when you're predicting the ability to understand what you read. And you can see how those components shift over time. So you see this shift, and sometimes this shift is described as a shift from learning to read to reading to learn. So instead of the simple view of reading being characterized by two equal components, what we see over time is that listening comprehension, well, first we see that they have shared variation. So there's something underlying the ability to do both of these skills. And then you see that listening comprehension becomes quite larger over time. Let's take a little bit deeper look at word reading and listening comprehension. So word reading, as described by what Bart was doing, is the ability to accurately translate printed letter patterns into spoken words. And this is an example of a non-word reading task from the Woodcock Reading Mastery. You probably might be familiar with it, Word Attack. And I'd venture to say you're all able to easily read these non-words, even though you might not have seen them before, because you have a stored representation of letter and letter sound patterns. Listening comprehension, on the other hand, is the ability to understand spoken language And I am often asked why I call it listening or language comprehension. And we did a study on this to look at what was the difference between the two. I use them interchangeably because they're really the same construct. Listening comprehension is typically measured by having a child listen to a story and answer questions. Language comprehension is a broader term that involves having children do a lot of different language comprehension tasks, like understanding directions, for instance. But they're measured slightly different, but we showed in a large sample of children, over 1,800 children across 4 states, that if you really look at the variation in these different skills of language, they all boil down to one construct of language comprehension. So I might call it listening comprehension or language comprehension, depending on how it was measured in the study. Let me give you an example of a listening comprehension task. So in this case, I'm going to read a story to you, and I'm going to ask you some questions. Now, in a listening comprehension task, I would not show you the words. I would just have you listen with your ears. But this drives everyone nuts in the audience. So I'm actually going to show it to you as I read it to you. Sally first let loose a team of gophers. The plan backfired when a dog chased them away. She then threw a party, but the guests failed to bring their motorcycles. Furthermore, her stereo system was not loud enough. Obscene phone calls gave her some hope until the number was changed. It was the installation of the blinking neon lights across the street that finally did the trick. Sally framed the ad from the classified section and now has it hanging on her wall. So I would venture to guess that this would be easy for you to read, and also that even if you were listening as a listening comprehension task, that you would likely understand all of the vocabulary words. But let's see if you can answer some comprehension questions. Number 1, where did Sally put the gophers? Number 2, why did Sally want the guests to bring their motorcycles? And number 3, what did the ad say? You might be thinking, it's a little late at night and I might not be comprehending this, but that's as intended. So this is to make the point that you can read the words on the page, and sometimes children can even understand the vocabulary words, but what they're often missing is the connection between what seem to be separate sentences that need to be held together. And often what creates that connection is background knowledge. So I'm going to give you the background knowledge you need to be able to comprehend this passage, so you can move from a poor comprehender to a good comprehender. So the background knowledge you need is the title of the passage. So I'll give you the title, and then I'll read it again and see if you can answer the questions. The title of the passage is Getting Rid of Bad Neighbors. Sally first let loose a team of gophers. The plan backfired when a dog chased them away. She then threw a party, but the guests failed to bring their motorcycles. Furthermore, her stereo system was not loud enough. Obscene phone calls gave her some hope until the number was changed. It was the installation of the blinking neon lights across the street that finally did the trick. Sally framed the ad from the classified section and now has it hanging on her wall. So background knowledge is like the glue that holds together what seem to be quite separate sentences. And almost as I read it, as you were probably thinking back to, this is getting rid of bad neighbors. So let's see here if you can answer the question. Where did Sally put the gophers? In the neighbor's yard. Why did Sally want the guests to bring their motorcycles? Because they were loud and annoying. What did the ad say? Likely home for sale or maybe apartment for rent. Now, I'd like to argue that Sally's the bad neighbor in this example, but it's just an example, so I'm going to share it with you. So this gives you a sense of what it would be like to be able to read words on a page and maybe even understand most of the vocabulary words, but not be able to comprehend the passage because you don't have a level of discourse or connecting all of the sentences together. And this is what we see in children with developmental language disorder. So in terms of the simple view, what we've learned from the many, many studies that have been conducted on the simple view is that we have to consider both components when we're thinking about reading. We can't think about reading as just word reading, and we can't think about reading as just comprehension. It's both of those key components. But what's language got to do with this? So I'm a speech language pathologist. I mentioned I study the connections of speech and language to literacy. So let me describe that for you a bit, tying it to the simple view of reading. So language in and of itself is a complex construct. It's typically described in terms of form, use, and content. So the form of language in spoken language is phonology, which is the sounds of a language. So it's how we're representing language by the sounds that we're producing. This is most primarily related to word reading. Now, this is admittedly a simple diagram to kind of describe this. There's more interconnections than I'm going to describe, but this is the primary component that drives letter-sound correspondence in terms of language. Now, pragmatics is the social use of language, and then content is vocabulary and grammar, sometimes referred to as semantics and grammar, and that's the content. So we know that the use and content of language is what underpins listening comprehension. So what's language got to do with it? Everything. Language has everything to do with the foundational skills associated with the simple view of reading, which are the primary components for reading comprehension. So language is very important, and we've studied this in our longitudinal samples again, and many people have. And here's an example of something we found related to language. So vocabulary skills are a primary indicator of language. And when we do structural equation models where we look at children as they're developing first grade, second grade, and third grade in this data set, so the first number is first grade, the second number is second grade, and the third one is third grade. What we see is that vocabulary is highly related to a child's ability to read words and also their ability to understand what they hear. But if you look at vocabulary directly to reading comprehension, we don't see this relationship, and this has been shown in several data sets. So vocabulary is underpinning reading comprehension through its influence on word reading and on listening comprehension. So we often hear that vocabulary is so important, and it absolutely is. You may have seen this before. This is the reading rope model that was created by Scarborough, and it represents the different components that underlie the simple view of reading, although she created it separate of the simple view of reading, really focusing on the components that were malleable or able to be stimulated in young children. So you see language comprehension involving background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, word recognition, underpinning is phonological awareness and decoding and sight word recognition. You can see that they become intertwined across development, and that results in skilled reading comprehension over time. This is a great graphic to share, I think, with parents and other professionals as you're describing the complexity of reading comprehension. We've used the simple view to really think through individual differences in poor readers. So we know, if you've been working with poor readers, that they're not all the same. They have strengths and weaknesses. So what we've done is use the simple view to help us better categorize poor readers based on their individual differences that would relate to the types of instruction that they would need to improve. So what we did is we took children who scored poorly on reading comprehension assessments. So these are children who have difficulty reading text and answering questions about that text. And then we further examined their word recognition or word reading abilities and their listening comprehension abilities. And we categorized them as poor and good in both of those skills. And what's resulted is what's referred to as the quadrant model. So what we found is that there was a group of children who had poor word reading, but good listening comprehension. So they had difficulty reading words on the page, but if you read the story to them, they would be able to understand it. And this is characteristic of the classic profile of children with dyslexia. We know that dyslexia at the heart is a word reading deficit, so difficulty connecting letters and sounds and storing those patterns in memory. Here's some facts about dyslexia. I want you to hold these in your memory, especially when we start thinking about developmental language disorder, because we'll talk about what's the same and what's different. So some facts about dyslexia. A person is born with dyslexia. It persists across the lifetime. It cuts across socioeconomic status and other disorders. It's a brain difference. The key areas of deficit are in letters, connecting letters and sounds, so phonological or sound processing and letter processing and making those connections. And there's been many laws across now 49 states which are requiring some type of education or implication for educational practice around dyslexia, with often seeing the hashtag of Say Dyslexia in public schools. Some resources that I really like is there's a short video. All these resources are contained in the QR code that you have access to. You'll also have the handouts at the end of the talk emailed to you. Dyslexia Foundation has webinars that are online for free. International Dyslexia Association has many fact sheets. The Reading League has lots of work in the language basis of reading. And I have a special issue where I mainly am addressing speech-language pathologists, but it's available to everyone, that's talking about many different aspects of dyslexia. And of course, Windward is becoming, quite the leader in also training around dyslexia and learning disabilities. Now, we looked at the flip side of this, and we also found there were children who had good word reading, but poor listening comprehension. This is really the reverse of what we would think for dyslexia. These children can read words on a page, but they have difficulty understanding the language that's created by those words. And these children have developmental language disorder. This quadrant has been named by myself and others with different labels across time. So these children have been called poor comprehenders, children with specific comprehension deficit. I'm calling them developmental language disorder to represent the longitudinal data we have showing that this is a pattern that exists prior to formal education and continues on. So developmental language disorder is when a child or adult has difficulty talking or understanding language. Now let's look at the facts associated with DLD. A person is born with DLD and it persists across the lifetime. It cuts across socioeconomic status and other disorders. It's a brain difference that makes it difficult to process the ambient language a child hears. The hallmarks of DLD are difficulty learning new words and remembering them, so vocabulary, learning and use, and grammar learning and use. So you can see there's a lot of similarities with dyslexia. The primary divergence is the area of difficulty. With dyslexia, it's a word reading deficit, and with DLD, it's really primarily a language comprehension deficit. Now, you've probably heard about dyslexia, but you haven't heard about DLD, and that's pretty common. So dyslexia, I say, has a lot of awareness in the public, but a lot of misunderstanding. DLD, very limited awareness. So we're trying to change that. I've been involved in a website called dldandme.org, where we have several short informational articles and infographics about lots of topics around DLD. Also, there's an international association called the Rattle Association, or Raising Awareness of DLD. They have fact sheets that have been translated in 20 languages. In fact, every language that's been studied has found to have children with DLD. Some myths about DLD. One big myth we find is that children with DLD mispronounce speech sounds. Well, DLD is about understanding and using language, but it's separate of producing speech sounds. Another one is that people with DLD don't speak proper English. Well, truthfully, there's no such thing as proper English. And it's not about following English rules. It's about having difficulty learning and using language. Another one is people with DLD are not smart, but we know that language skill is independent of intellectual ability, and about 50% of children with DLD have average to high average intellect, whereas about 50% have a co-occurring intellectual disability. So it's not related to intelligence, it's separate. Another myth is that bilingualism causes DLD. In fact, children with DLD benefit from learning multiple languages. Even though it can take them longer over time, they do become multilingual. And the biggest myth, the most damning myth, I would say, is that poor parenting causes DLD. So parents will say, I should have talked to them more, I should have read more books, and we know, just like we know in the area of dyslexia, it's not what is happening from what parents are doing. This is a brain difference that occurs, and though language can be helpful in the home, it is not going to cure DLD, and it's not the cause of DLD. When we think about language development in children with DLD, what we found is that children with DLD develop language like their typically developing peers, but it's like a train leaving the station late, which was a metaphor used by Mabel Rice, who has studied DLD for many years in longitudinal samples across generations. She says it's like the train is leaving the station late, but the track is the same as typically developing children. So we know that children who have DLD are late talkers. Not all children who are late talkers have DLD, but all children with DLD were late talkers. So they see that it takes longer for them to produce their first words and their multi-word utterances. Why is DLD described as developmental? Well, what we see is that DLD manifests differently depending on the language guidelines or the language characteristics of each age. So toddlers, what we see as a characteristic of DLD is that they're late talkers. And late talkers are defined as children who are 2 years old who have less than 50 words and no two-word combinations. So children with DLD, they fall into that category. In preschool and kindergarten, what we see from children with DLD is immature grammar. So you'll see they will use pronouns incorrectly. So they will use, for instance, instead of saying he and she, they'll say him and her. So him go to the store, as opposed to he goes to the store. Now in elementary school and beyond, persons with DLD have difficulty connecting sentences together to tell a cohesive story and also to understand narratives and expository information. So this is at that discourse level where they're connecting sentences together. Even though their grammar will become more mature, this is how DLD manifests over time. So it's a developmental disorder and it changes over time and the child is born with it. As part of the awareness, raising awareness for DLD, they create videos every year. So I'm going to share an informative 2-minute video about DLD, I think, that describes in particular how DLD can change across time.
Developmental Language Disorder, or DLD for short, is a type of neurodiversity like autism, ADHD, and dyslexia. DLD is common. If you know 100 people, the chances are you know 7 people with DLD. DLD occurs in every language and every country across the world. People with DLD find understanding and using language, including words and sentences, particularly challenging. DLD is developmental, which means it starts in childhood, but it doesn't go away. As individuals grow, what DLD looks like and how it impacts changes, which means support needs to change too. It's about growing with DLD. Meet Rad. One day when Rad was 4 years old, Rad's dad noticed Rad looking a little sad when they were at a family gathering. He talked to Rad and understood that Rad wanted to play with a toy but didn't know the words. Rad's dad helped by showing Rad how to ask, "Can I play with a toy?" It's about growing with DLD. When Rad was 8 years old, the teacher noticed that Rad would often struggle, especially when working alone. She realized this was because Rad did not understand some of the instructions. They talked together and agreed that she would write important instructions on the board. It's about growing with DLD. Rad is older now and at work. The manager noticed that Rad was anxious about presenting at team meetings, so they had a short chat and created notes to help Rad organize what to say. It's about growing with DLD. People don't grow out of DLD. But families, teachers, coworkers, and friends can all take simple actions to help children, teenagers, and adults with DLD to grow and be who they want to be. It's about growing with DLD. To find out more information about how you can help people with DLD, go to rattled.org.
So that's an example of an informational video that was created this year for raising awareness around DLD. And you can imagine how a similar video might be created for dyslexia as well. There's a lot of similarities between DLD and dyslexia, but the primary difference is the underlying deficit. So in terms of the simple view of reading, what we see is that dyslexia is primarily associated with word reading problems in the simple view of reading, whereas DLD is associated with listening comprehension. Now, what we also find is that there are many children who have both dyslexia and DLD. It's about a 50% overlap across many studies, so it ranges from 30 to 80% depending on the population. So that means that 50% of children with dyslexia have DLD, and 50% of children with DLD have dyslexia. So when I'm presenting to groups, I say, if you work with the children with dyslexia, many of them have DLD. And if you work with children with DLD, many of them have dyslexia, but they require different supports. One requires support for word reading and the other for language comprehension. And if children have both, they require support for both. So this is an example, though, of what our data look like. I show this because when I show this model, it looks like there were neat clusters of children. But actually what we see in the data is that it's a continuum across the different abilities. So these are arbitrary cut points. So some children are right on the borderline of qualifying of having dyslexia. It's on a continuum from mild to severe, and the same for DLD. This is an example of some of the percentages in each category. We'll go back to that in a moment. A question I often get is dyslexia a language disorder? And the answer is yes and no. So yes, it is a language disorder because it's a part of language that's their primary area of deficit, which is in phonology. But it's not a developmental language disorder because the primary area of deficit for developmental language disorder is grammar and semantics. So they're both childhood language disorders, but they have difficulties in different areas of language. And this is written up in an open access article called Understanding Dyslexia in the Context of Developmental Language Disorders. And if you received the Beacon, you'll see that that article was printed, portions of it, in the Beacon for the Windward Institute recently. So the take-home messages when thinking about what is DLD, what are the characteristics, and how is it similar or different than dyslexia? First, we know that children with dyslexia have a deficit in word reading, and that can range from mild to severe. Children with DLD have a deficit in language comprehension, and that also ranges from mild to severe. 50% of children who have DLD have dyslexia and vice versa. Both children with dyslexia and DLD have language deficits, but their language deficits are slightly different. Here's a key point. Almost all poor readers, whether they have dyslexia or DLD, have early speech and language delays. So early speech and language delays are a huge red flag. Actually, I would argue a crystal ball into what's going to happen in the future for children with literacy. And we can do something about that by looking at early identification. So let's think about the simple view across development. I mentioned that we have longitudinal samples, and what we've done is model the simple view across development. First, looking at the precursors to word reading and language comprehension in pre-kindergarten children, and then we look to see how that develops across time related to reading comprehension. And it truly is a crystal ball. So this is a structural equation model, just to give you a sense of how many measures we have. The boxes represent the individual assessments, and the circles represent the constructs. So what you'll see is that oral language here was measured by a variety of tasks that all were related to oral language, and that was highly predictive, 0.8, the highest is 1, as related to grade 3 listening comprehension. So this is data following the same children from pre-kindergarten to grade 3, testing them every year. So 5 years later, we're able to highly predict a child's listening comprehension from their initial oral language. And the same can be found for pre-kindergarten code-related skills such as phonological awareness, letter knowledge, and rapid automatic naming. That's related to future word reading. And then you see that grade 3 listening comprehension and word recognition is what is explaining individual differences in reading comprehension. This is a graphic we created of that same data for the International Dyslexia Association, where you see that deficits in preschool in oral language or in code-related skills. Again, this is a crystal ball that we can't ignore and wait and see. This means that we have to have some early intervention, and we have to measure this in the pre-K period. And if a child has preschool developmental language disorder, speech sound disorder, or autism spectrum disorder, that is also a big red flag for having future difficulties. And this is from our longitudinal data of children that we've followed over time. So some of the implications that we find is that these skills, although they're related, they are separable. That means that we need attention to both language comprehension and word reading across development. We have to stimulate both. If we stimulate one and not the other, then children are not going to have their best reading comprehension. We can also have early identification of both word reading and of listening comprehension. The take-home message here is that school-age children with speech and language impairments, they're often the struggling readers, and we know this from many studies. I'm going to tell you a story to put in perspective how this might really play out in school systems for these children. And this is an actual story that I heard from a parent, but it really relates to a lot of stories that I hear. So I had a parent contact me and say, I would like you to help me figure out how to work with my child and what to do for support. My child has 4 different disorders, is what this parent told me. The parent said that in early childhood, around 2, her child wasn't talking. So they contacted early intervention. He received a label of developmental delay. He received some early intervention services. But right before he turned 3, he had made some good progress, and he was dismissed from early intervention services. So then he went on to an early childhood program where he attended preschool. In the early childhood program, a year later, at age 4, he was picked up and he received the label of speech and language impairment. Then he was dismissed right before kindergarten. He had made some progress. He went into kindergarten. In kindergarten, he seemed to do okay with word reading and, had some difficulty, but seemed to be making progress. And then now he's in first grade, he received a diagnosis of ADHD from a neuropsych evaluation. Then in third grade, he was picked up for services again, and this time his diagnosis was specific learning disability. So where does DLD fit into this? And even dyslexia as another example. Where does it fit? Well, actually, what we know is that dyslexia and/or developmental language disorder, this is the diagnosis that the child would receive. But these are the labels that the child has received to qualify for support services. So you can see how confusing this is for parents and advocates, because the child really has two primary areas of difficulty. One is developmental language disorder, and the other is ADHD. But this parent thinks that there's 4 difficulties. The other thing about this story, which I see consistently, is did you notice I mentioned that he's dismissed from services and then picked up again? So there's not a consistent level of support. And what we'd like to see is this changed. It's a big part of the legislation around dyslexia is to have a label that the child can use to receive the support they need over time, like we see with autism, and that's what we're shooting for developmental language disorder as well. But why isn't DLD better known? I've hinted to it, and as Jamie said, that it is the same prevalence as dyslexia, so we find about 1 in 10 children have developmental language disorder, and again, this has been converging evidence from multiple samples across the world. And I think there's a few reasons why DLD isn't better known. One of them is language is hard to explain. As I mentioned, it's a complex construct. It involves lots of different areas such as phonology, vocabulary, grammar, and even pragmatics. Another one is that language difficulties, I would argue, are easy to conceal or can be very misunderstood. What we often see as the characteristics of DLD are described as personality traits, like my child is shy, my child is hesitant, my child doesn't like to participate in conversation, my child likes to play alone. That's on the good end. On the bad end, we see that these children can be described as lazy, as antisocial, and as disruptive. So language difficulties can be easy to conceal as other characteristics. Another one is that language development is not well understood because it's thought that children will just catch up over time. And late talkers really confuse matters because about 75% of children who are late talkers do eventually grow out of this and have typical language development. They don't tend to be the language stars, but they have typical development. But it's the 25% of children who don't, those are the ones that go on to have DLD. So if we use late talker as the metric, we would be over-identifying quite a few children. So a lot of work is being done on early identification. Another one is that language has primarily been the domain of speech-language pathologists. Those are the speech-language pathologists' kids, not everyone's kids. They're the ones that go out and get some services or get identified by the speech-language pathologist. So there's been less attention to how DLD affects academic performance. The other one is that it's been called by many different names. So in the research terminology, we see that DLD has been referred to as primarily specific language impairment, but also a language learning impairment and primary language impairment. In clinical terminology in the DSM, it's referred to as language disorder or a specific learning disability in the area of spoken language or written language. In terms of insurances for ICD-9 code or ICD-10, it's been referred to as expressive language disorder or expressive receptive language disorder. And as I mentioned through my story, in educational settings, it's referred to, depending on the age, as developmental delay, speech and language impairment, or specific learning disability. So it's been called by many, many different labels. One study showed that it's been called by over 150 labels in the literature alone. So we had to have one label. So there had to be consensus around one label, and that happened in 2017. There was a consensus across the world involving educators and clinicians and some parents to come together to say, what is this going to be called? And they decided on developmental language disorder. Since then, there's been a lot of advocacy. One paper that won Paper of the Year for the American Speech Language Hearing Association was How We Fail Children with Developmental Language Disorder, because we haven't really been advocating and working closely with these children through educational practice. And as I said, I've been part of that advocacy through the development of DLDandme.org. And there's dldandme.org, we have lots of different informational articles like working memory and developmental language disorder, school achievement and developmental language disorder, the differences between DLD and autism spectrum, which is one of our top downloaded articles. As part of developmental or DLD awareness, we have a DLD awareness day. Dyslexia has a month. We have a day. Maybe we'll get a month sometime. It's still in October, but we're working towards it. So one thing that we do consistently is light up monuments all over the world with the colors of DLD awareness, purple and yellow. The Niagara Falls was even lit up purple and yellow on DLD Awareness Day. So that was just October 14th recently. As Jamie mentioned, I have a podcast, See Her Speak podcast, where I have many episodes on DLD and the history of DLD, awareness campaigns, working memory, ADHD, and a parent's perspective. And I often talk throughout each podcast about DLD and dyslexia. A big shout out, I was very honored to be included on the Read podcast as Danielle's the host to talk about DLD early on in the podcast. And she also invited me back as a second time, and that episode will be released on November 2nd. So I was very honored to be talking to Danielle again, and she will be coming to my podcast as well. So let's talk about when DLD is identified, because this is a major problem in our awareness campaigns. So what do you think? What percentage of children with DLD are identified as having language difficulties in kindergarten? And this actually accounts for when they're identified in kindergarten, first, second, early elementary grades. This is also first shown in the mid-90s, and it continues on today. I just had a study last year that showed the exact same percentage. So is it 90%, 75%? 50 or 20%? It's 20%. This has been consistently shown for 3 decades. So nothing is changing. That means that 8 out of 10 children with DLD are left to struggle, and they are left to feel a lot of shame and frustration and not receiving the support they need. So DLD, common but hidden, only 20% are identified. But actually, let me go back to this. Studies have shown that have started to look at who are these 20% that are identified. Now, you would think they might be the children who have the most severe language difficulty. That's what I would hypothesize. But actually, what's consistently found is that there's 2 factors that predict who receives support services if you have DLD. One is, do you have an executive function disorder? And typically, what we see is that that is a child who is being disruptive or fidgety in the class. They go for a further evaluation, and then it's discovered that they have DLD. The second one is if they have a parent, in particular in these studies, a mother with high socioeconomic status. So this would be arguably a person who can advocate for this child to receive services. This is not good. This is a social justice issue, because this means that there's happenstance of having a co-occurring deficit or having resources that are getting these children services. That means that 80% of children with DLD are not getting the services they need. And what we find is that it has nothing to do with severity. So children who have very severe DLD are not receiving services. What's the long-term impact of not receiving services or validation or education on DLD? Well, we know that these children have low self-esteem, a lot of shame. They're unable to negotiate their environment and meet their goals through language. They have reading deficits, and this leads to knowledge deficits. They're more likely to have juvenile delinquency, and a study in girls with DLD showed they have a higher rate of sexual assault. A recent study also looked at their ability to understand their Miranda rights, and they were not good at understanding that. So even as they're navigating the world, they're not able to understand the language around them. This was a study showing the long-term impact of receiving support. And so this said that this is children who were 24, who had had early intervention or who hadn't. And it showed adults with a history of DLD who received early intervention during their school years reported less contact with local police services. And they argued there's a need for early identification. Early intervention aimed at these difficulties could have distal outcomes in relation to also offending and the school-to-prison pipeline. But why isn't DLD caught early? Well, there's a few reasons that I found in my research and others. One is that there's a myth that language screening is time-consuming. Actually, there's several language screeners that can be administered that are short, and there's even some that can be administered group administration that can test 20 kids in about 10 minutes. The next myth is that language screenings are not reliable. Well, there's several reliable screeners, and there's even more and more coming out on the market. But the biggest thing I run into is that the schools I work with, they think they're already screening for language, but they're actually screening for reading. So how is that the case? Well, I did tell you that the simple view of reading was simple, but it's actually not so simple when you look across development, and I've hinted at this in the beginning of the presentation. Reading changes over time, and that impacts who is identified early versus late. So what we find is that, as we showed, word reading is really the driving factor to reading comprehension in the early grades. And then over time, listening comprehension takes over. So what this means is in the early grades, even if you give a reading comprehension assessment, you're really just measuring word reading. Because word reading in the early grades is what's predicting comprehension. You have to take the word reading out of it and do a listening comprehension task. So what we're doing is, even if it's a comprehension measure in the early grades, it's really just word reading. And we see this, as we showed before, this change over time that occurs, where you have word reading predicting reading comprehension and then listening comprehension. And you can think about even how we test reading comprehension. So here's an example. This is from the Woodcock Reading Mastery, Passage Comprehension. This is a way to test reading comprehension that we ask children to read the passage and then to fill in the blank, and that gives us a sense of their reading comprehension. So for this one, which is grade 1 and below, the child is asked to read, "The boy has a cap on his," and then fill in the blank. There is a picture support of a boy walking with a cap on his head. What we found is that if children can read the words, the language is just so easy that even children with developmental language disorder, as long as they can read the words, they're able to fill in the blank. It's just easy. It's not taxing their language ability. But if you cannot read the words on the page, you're going to fail the reading comprehension assessment, which is what we see for children with dyslexia. Now let's jump ahead to grade 4. So grade 4, what we see is that, first off, there's no picture support. There's more words, and there's more complex grammar and vocabulary. So the child's asked to read, "The can of paint is nearly full. Susan will use it to blank the walls." There's multiple answers that could be correct, and you can see that it gets even trickier in terms of structure, syntax, and grammar and vocabulary in the second passage. So in this case, reading the words is not enough. You have to use your listening comprehension ability because you can't make a guess. It's not as easy, so the language is more difficult. And what you'll see here is this is reflected in our analysis as well of the subgroups. So for instance, you see that we have 32% of children in second grade that qualify as having dyslexia. And then in fourth grade, what we see is that the same amount of children, the profile is very similar, but about 10% of them start to compensate with their strong language skills, and so they don't have reading comprehension deficits. So they have word reading problems still, but they don't come out as having comprehension deficits. So they're starting to compensate. We see the opposite for specific comprehension deficit, or DLD. And so what we found is that in second grade, there's about 16%. And then later you see that there's 31%. The same 31% in fourth grade that show up here, they had the same language skills before, but these are children who are able to read words. So they were able to read the words, and then the language wasn't that hard, so they were able to compensate. So there's a play of compensation going on here. And what we see is that you start to see more children emerge as having specific comprehension deficit, and these children are often referred to as late emerging poor readers. You see it's pretty stable in 8th grade. So what we find is that in early identification now, it's primarily focused on reading word reading. We're catching children who have dyslexia, and you catch children who have dyslexia plus DLD, but we're not catching children who have DLD only, and that's about 50% of children with DLD. So these are children who are able to read words, but they're not able to understand the language that they're hearing. So what I want you to remember here is that those late emerging poor readers that I mentioned, the studies have shown that most late emerging poor readers are actually late identified. They're not late emerging. They always had language comprehension deficits, but we didn't test for them. And we had a study where we took advantage of some data from the nationwide child care study. And so we had data from the open Access database, and we found children who were in 5th grade who emerged late. So they were late emerging poor readers. They didn't show up as having difficulties in the early grades, but they showed up in 5th grade. We looked at their language ability starting at 15 months and on, and we could see their language problems even as early as 15 months. So they always had language comprehension deficits, but it wasn't captured until later when reading comprehension measures became hard enough to capture them. So they're late identified. What does this mean for us? This means that we need to measure oral language early on to capture these children, to provide them the support they need early on. So right now, we really have a model where we're focusing on early detection of word reading difficulties associated with dyslexia, and that's only one half of the simple view of reading. What we have to do is start to attend to the other half, and that is to improve the early identification of language comprehension in children early on. And I've written about this with a colleague, and we called it, "If you don't look, you won't see," because that's exactly it. If we don't measure language comprehension early on in the grades, we won't see the children who are going to struggle later. So I have an open access document which shows early screenings that are available for DLD. It looks like this, where we have the early screeners, and we're adding a lot to it because there's more and more screeners that are coming out for oral language difficulty, and the sophisticated algorithms that are used for dynamic assessment, for the new dynamic assessments of dyslexia, are including oral language as well. So that's very exciting. Because what we could do early on is we could start to capture the quadrants and what children are likely to have. So are they likely to be in the dyslexia only quadrant? Are they likely to be in the DLD only, or both? And that will drive the types of specialized instruction that they would receive. There's also the tools chart that I've been involved in. This is a way to represent screening tools for word reading and math. I just have to throw it out because it's something that's been in the works. We've been doing this for over a decade. It's another way to look at the screening tools that are available in progress monitoring screening and also in intervention. Looks like this, like consumer reports, and a lot of education, the State Department of Education use this to determine which screeners qualify as adequate for the state. So if you're in a position where you can make some decisions, this is a good one to take a look at. So we've been thinking through these windows of opportunities, which are thinking about prevention models versus just waiting to see. And I wrote this paper with my mentor, Hugh Katz, in the Reading League Journal that is called Dyslexia, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of diagnosis. And the idea is that the earlier we catch these children, even making small changes early on, and you know this as educators, you see those small changes early on, that changes the whole trajectory. If you've played Angry Birds, you have a very good sense of how you can make a small tweak and it can change the trajectory, and that's the case with children. Making a small tweak early on, we can see major changes over time, and that involves the prevention model, which is universal screening, so screening all children for risk of dyslexia and DLD, providing high-quality Tier 1 instruction, progress monitoring over time, and providing instruction that matches their needs. And then if we do this, we have fewer long-term consequences, negative long-term consequences. We have less early reading failure, and then we have it's more cost-effective because we're catching them earlier and providing them the boost they need. If we wait till 2nd, 3rd grade and beyond, then we're looking at more detailed assessment and evaluation, more likelihood of receiving intense special education, and then more negative consequences because the child struggled for some time. And then we have delayed reading success, which causes delayed knowledge acquisition. And of course, it's less cost effective. So I know you in this room are interested in this as educators, and I'm trying to help you think through not only early identification of word reading difficulties, but also early identification for oral language. So this is the school-based model you might be familiar with, response to intervention or multi-tiered systems of support. What we're doing is trying to think through tying together both the instruction and the assessment component. So what this involves is screening all children in the classroom and then providing all children in the classroom evidence-based classroom instruction. Then you have progress monitoring over time, so children who are struggling would go down to Tier 2, and they would receive small group intensive instruction while monitoring their progress to determine who needs a boost or who might be a false positive in your screening. And then some of them will require individualized testing, which would lead to an individualized education plan, but it should be very few, and the research has shown that 95% of children can read well if they're provided with this structure. But what we see now is that this RTI model is focused primarily on word reading. So it's focused on really thinking through how do we address word reading and not thinking about oral language. So what we have to think about is an RTI model that is for word reading and an RTI model that's for oral language as well. So there's two simultaneous response to intervention or multi-tiered systems of support for word reading and for language. So we have lots of what we call hashtag goals, which is routine screening that we're working towards for word reading and also language comprehension, evidence-based instruction for both at all grades. So not a linear process where there's a focus on word reading, then a focus on comprehension. We should be focusing on language comprehension all along the continuum from pre-K all the way through. Just as we would want to see more focus on word reading at the later grades as well. And we want it to be developmentally appropriate instruction. And we also want to think through building an understanding of neurodiversity and neurodivergence with the idea that every child is coming to school with a specific brain architect. That's going to make some things easier and harder, and it's going to be on a continuum. And it's really thinking about social emotional acceptance. So I do want to highlight that the work I've done has resulted in over 800 language comprehension lessons that are available for free online from pre-K to grade 3. And you just have to download them. We have a randomized control trial that shows their efficacy. They can be modified for Tier 1 or Tier 2. There's also lessons that are available for middle and high school through other programs that have been funded by the Department of Education. Oftentimes these aren't known because we don't have a publisher. They're free online, and that's something we need to work with, is better access for you as a public. They are free, but I say that they're actually prepaid because you paid for them with your tax dollars. So this was your tax dollars at work. So what we found in our intervention work, to wrap up here, is that we found 5 key malleable factors. Malleable meaning that we can instruct children and show improvement over time. And so these key factors are vocabulary, grammar, inferencing, comprehension monitoring, and text structure knowledge. I intentionally graphically created vocabulary to be the largest block because we consistently find it to be one of the primary drivers in listening comprehension. It's critically important. So I'm just going to touch on each of these and talk about how to support children in the classroom and at home with DLD. So in terms of vocabulary, what we know is that it's not so much about the number of words children know, but it's about the depths of those words and the connections. We know we have to provide them basic concepts, and we have to, or basic definition, child-friendly definitions, and we have to tell them how new words are linked to known words in their vocabulary. So we're creating a semantic web for their words. And we're teaching them about subtle differences, about why an author might choose, for instance, to have the word tulip versus rose, because if the author chooses the word tulip, it's going to activate other words for you, like maybe spring, maybe the Netherlands. And so you're going to be thinking about other words as you tie together one word. So I like to think of it as if you pick one word and you pull it out of your vocabulary, it's activating all these other words that are similar. We know that multisensory exposure is very helpful, and that point of contact learning is also very helpful because each vocabulary word has the semantics or the meaning. It has the sound of the word and also the way it's represented in letters. We know that teaching new vocabulary with all 3 of these components creates a richer representation of each of those vocabulary words. There's some very cool work looking experimentally, for instance, that if you teach a new vocabulary word and show the spelling, that when you take the spelling away, you're more likely to remember how to say it, even if the spelling's not there. So the more points of contact for vocabulary words, the more likely it is to be remembered, especially by children who have language comprehension deficits. This is a great resource, Bringing Words to Life, which describes a very clear evidence-based way to think through vocabulary instruction. Of course, I saw that happening at Windward today. Grammar instruction is a little trickier, but there's great resources like Bookshare Time where you can pick mentor texts. A mentor text is finding a text that has a lot of opportunities to practice a specific grammatical structure. So for example, if you're wanting to stimulate irregular past tense verbs, a good mentor text would be The Very Hungry Caterpillar, because you can say 8 1,000 times in that book. So you want a lot of opportunities to be able to model certain structures in grammar by the text. This is a great reference in your handout, which is the grammar guide. It's the grammar guide you never knew you always needed, so remind you all about the different grammar rules that are out there and how they're developmentally appropriate across time. We also know that there's a big effect of teacher language related to grammar. So what the study showed, it looked at teacher language compared to children's language growth, and it showed that the results implied that a complex syntax is an important source of linguistic information for word learners, and that teacher syntax is an often overlooked but potentially malleable dimension to classroom quality. So the more complex the teacher's language was, had an influence on the complexity of language used by children in the classroom. Turning to higher level language skills, first one is inferencing. Inferencing is really filling in the gaps with background knowledge, like the example of getting rid of bad neighbors, is teaching children that there's gaps in the passages and that those gaps need to be filled with background knowledge. So some of the ways that's done is activating background knowledge before reading and asking some inferential questions to try to picture what the child's going through. So for instance, if you have a story of Bobby making a sandcastle, next he's red-faced and the castle is flattened, presumably by a wave. You might follow with some questions, inferential questions like, what do you think could knock over the castle? And then when they do determine that, you could ask how they knew it, so trying to really highlight the gaps. Comprehension monitoring is providing different strategies to check and helping children become active readers to check whether they are really comprehending along the way. So having some, main idea checks, doing think alouds where teachers are modeling a comprehension breakdown and how to fix it. We use these in the curriculum that I mentioned, which is called Let's Know, where we have teachers hold up like a symbol of, I didn't think I got that, versus, aha, I got it, to really check the child's comprehension. Text structure knowledge is really teaching the structure of text, whether it's narrative or expository, teaching the key elements of a narrative. I've often used some visual references. So I had a child who was an artist, so we tied in each component had a visual, a color that was associated with it, and then she would carry a little keychain around. So when she was telling a story, she would make sure she told each of the colors of the story rainbow. So this is just a way to make sure that children are not only understanding narrative, but also producing more comprehensive narratives. And then we know there's expository text structure. I saw this so well done here, is teaching children to really look for the text structure that happens in expository text, like a problem versus a solution, description, compare and contrast, cause and effect, and the language associated with that. So some of the ways we know to help children with DLD in school specifically is, number one, we have to look for DLD. We have to screen for DLD, and we need to think through implementation science, which is really thinking through what is the best way to implement the research that we have into practice. It's likely to differ by context. So some schools may use a certain screener because of the population of children they have or the system they have in place. So it's really looking at how to bridge the gap. We also know we need to provide high-quality, evidence-based, tiered language comprehension instruction. It can't just be given by the speech-language pathologist. It has to have a language-rich environment throughout the classroom, because pulling children out or having a few minutes with them every day is not enough language stimulation to make a big difference for children with developmental language disorder. They have to be in a language-rich environment. Also, we can just talk about DLD. So if you go back and share with your colleagues or your parents what DLD is, everyone who's listening to this talk, if you did it for 10 people, that's going to make a huge impact. The more we talk about DLD, the more common it will be, like ADHD, like dyslexia. Collaborating with SLP is a big favorite, I think. We need more SLPs collaborating as much as they can. SLPs have a very large caseload. It's a big problem, and they have a wide scope of practice. We also can support peer relations, so helping children talk to their peers, and facilitating some of that is helpful. We've written up a lot about how to support children with DLD in the classroom, and here's a few more tips. One thing we can do is face the child. We can make clear, explicit statements to them. We can repeat and rephrase key instructions. They have difficulty with understanding instructions. We can use multimedia supports like writing down instructions, allowing extra time to process language. It can take them 2 to 3 times more time just to process language. We can ask the children to repeat back the instructions. I saw this happening also in the classroom here. We can break down larger information into discernible chunks. We can use visually distinct sections within text. We can use graphics and icons, provide key definitions, and have questions and text on the same page, so keeping it very close together. All of these things are key aspects that have been found to help children with DLD in the classroom. And we want to think also about supporting children with DLD outside of school. So school is a primary area where they can get language stimulation, but children with DLD can also be supported in all of their environments. So first off, telling parents about DLD. In my newest podcast, I'm going to actually try to release it tonight. We'll see if I can get it done, maybe tomorrow. I talk with a speech-language pathologist who's written a lot about how do you provide the diagnosis to parents in a way that is digestible, that they can understand it, and that they can then support children at home. And I think a lot of what she says is also can be applied and has been applied to dyslexia as well. We want to encourage discussions about DLD around children who have DLD and including the child. So making DLD just a part of who they are. So explaining it to them, empowering them. There's a book from the UK that was recently published called DLD and Me for adolescents with DLD. It's a workbook that they go through with their parents or educator to teach them how to empower themselves to advocate for themselves over time, because they're going to keep growing with DLD and they're going to have to become their own advocates. Another key aspect is to stimulate language through daily routines. We know parents are very overwhelmed with so much that's going on, and so including language stimulation around, for instance, feeding times or dinner times or bath time, things that are already happening in the car, talking about definitions of words, connecting words, and also parents can do everything that I said in the classroom, parents can do at home. So having the child face them, give them extra processing time, all of that can be done at home as well as stimulating language through daily routines. It's been shown that if you ask parents to do one more thing, it's less likely to be done. But if you pair it, like in Atomic Habits, if you pair it with something you're already doing, it's more likely to happen. I have a podcast with someone who studies feeding, and she looked at language around feeding interactions, not just dinner, but even with young children. And if you can stimulate language during feeding, it shows that you can really make a big difference in the language stimulation the child receives, because it's something you're doing all the time with your child. Another thing we know with children with DLD is they need extra time for homework, so allowing that space and time will create less frustration for children with DLD, and if parents know that ahead of time, they can plan accordingly, so that they can't just say, oh, we're going to have 10 minutes and we're going to do this homework really quickly. We know that they need more time, and again, all of this can apply for children with dyslexia as well. So thank you so much. Speaking of time, thank you so much for your time. I'm ending right on time. And I just want to thank you and wish you good luck, because you really are changing the world one child at a time. Thank you so much.
Just want to extend a real heartfelt thank you, Tiffany. Every time I've had a chance, today, I want to thank Alexis too for like separating Tiffany and I every chance we had to sit down and talk, because it was like we were just going to keep talking and talking and talking. I just really appreciate the passion, the enthusiasm, the work you do, the support of our kids. Just truly an exceptional researcher, truly an exceptional support and advocate for children. So thank you for everything, and thanks for being here tonight. So it was such a pleasure to show you the great work we do and have you get a chance to interact with our teachers and our students. So yeah. And just want to say a big thank you for all you who joined us here tonight in person and for everyone at home. This concludes our lecture, and I wish you all well. And please join us. If you've not listened to Read Podcast, I'm going to encourage you to do so. If you have not,